I'm so thrilled to be talking to you, Bernardine, today. I really, really love your book, and it's
Likewise.
really exciting to be talking over Zoom to you. And I really wanted to ask you how you feel about the label political fiction. Because on the one hand, it's the most incredible compliment. And of course, you want your work to be political. I mean, it clearly is very political. But on the other hand, is there ever, as a novelist, a kind of wariness about the label political?
The really interesting thing is that I'm not usually called a political writer, and I am a political writer. So Girl, Woman, Other is my 8th book, and all of my books are very political in terms of the kind of ideas that I'm exploring and the context of my characters, and also the very sort of subversive way in which I'm exploring sort of the Afro-diasporic experience and Black British history, plus other things. And so to be shortlisted for this prize, for me, is quite novel, because it is an acknowledgement of the politics of my work. And that doesn't really happen. But also the context for my own work has changed somewhat, because, you know, I did win the Booker in October, and everything changed. And the book went out there into the world. And so people are reading my book now, irrespective of any of the labels that are put on it or imposed on it. And I will impose Black British onto it myself, because that is what I explore, and that's the perspective from which I write. So I'm not really concerned that the idea that people will see it as political fiction will in some way challenge them to such an extent that they don't want to read it. And also because there is also the implication that if something is political, we often think of it as left-wing. You know, somebody said to me the other day, it's really hard to find novelists and poets who are right-wing. I was like, oh, that's interesting. So I think then the sort of assumption might be that your book is in some way didactic and telling people what to do and what they should think. But the book is political, and it is also many other things.
The kind of guiding principle behind the Orwell Prize that, you know, we've both been nominated for, and it's such a kind of joy, is that his defining ambition was to make political writing into an art. And do you think that that kind of ambition hints at this slight delicateness around, you know, what is literature and what is kind of political tract, and the need to disguise the political message in something that is valuable in its own right?
That's one of the issues, I think. And but at the same time, we can say that all literature is political. You know, if we think of politics with a small p in terms of power relationships and hierarchies, then most literature, I think we could categorize it as political. Some literature is more political, obviously, than others. But the thing about what I'm doing is writing a book about Black women, and I'm stating it as such. And that's something that is not really the case when you're talking about white writers or white male writers. So is it not political, for example, for a white male writer to only write books from the perspective of white men, or from the perspective of white middle-aged heterosexual middle-class men? To me, that is a very political act, but we never look at it like that. You know, it's only when we're in certain kinds of conversations that we even raise that as a subject matter. But when I'm writing about Black British women, or womanson, because one of the characters is non-binary, or even my other books, it's seen as very consciously being about Blackness, which it is. But that doesn't mean to say that other books aren't consciously about, or maybe subconsciously about race, white people, or gender, or heterosexuality, for example. And then that becomes something that we're beaten up with. The idea that you are somehow writing about social issues, or you're writing about politics, and therefore it's not real art. And that certainly is part of, or it certainly used to be part of, the culture of poetry. You know, real poetry is devoid of politics. It just exists. And anybody who is sort of inserting politics into their work is somehow demeaning and kind of sullying the art form. So yeah, so it's interesting. So now I've got a question for you. Obviously, it's very different because you're a journalist, and your kind of mission is to educate people, and that's something I think it's your mission. Tell me if I'm wrong, but that's something also that you've done with your book, clearly, which has just had a phenomenal impact in our society in raising awareness, but also affecting government and government decisions. So how does politics play out with your work?
Well, I think as journalists, we're meant to be objective. We are not meant to reveal anything about our own politics, and we're meant to be asking questions and giving a voice to people who perhaps otherwise aren't able to directly seize the attention of politicians and people in power. So that's really, I think, what I've done in my book, and why I really wanted to write it, because a lot of the issues raised in the Windrush Betrayal are issues that were highlighted in The Guardian, and which attracted a lot of kind of political response in 2018, helped lead to the resignation of the Home Secretary, and did change policy, which was, totally thrilling, and probably the only time, well, the most significant time in my career where I've ever seen that kind of link between writing articles and clear political change. But the kind of importance of putting it in a book is to make sure that people kind of understand the long roots of the problems that caused the Windrush scandal, and also have a bit more time to engage with the very complicated and very different stories of so many people affected. And I think as a journalist, it's kind of frustrating sometimes to have an 800-word slot to try and explain both the difficulties that an individual is experiencing and really complex bits of policy and legislation. And so to have a book and to have much more space to be able to immerse readers into all of the kind of people's experiences was just an amazing and very different experience for me. It was the first book I've written.
And what a book. So, but also I think there are connections between what I do and what you do, because I'm very much interested in history with my writing. All of my books in some way reflect on the past, as well as being contemporary books. I wrote a novel, The Emperor's Babe, a verse novel, was published in 2001, about a Black girl growing up in Roman London. And I wanted to explore the Black presence in history going back nearly 2,000 years, because we were here then. And but what I did was I created an alternate universe where, even though it was set in the past, I was also commenting on our contemporary society. So in your book, you go back and you kind of explore imperialism and colonialism, because you need people to understand the roots of this situation that we have here today, which is, I think, one of its strengths.
Yeah, I was really interested to see last month, or rather at the end of March, when we finally got an amazing 300-page report into what went wrong and what caused the Windrush scandal, that was written by Wendy Williams, who was commissioned by the Home Office to investigate it all. And one of the key findings she had was that ministers and Home Office officials had got very little understanding about Britain's colonial history, Britain's history of empire, our own immigration laws going back throughout the 20th century, and our nationality acts. And she said it was clearly that institutional ignorance that led to problems that effectively were, she described as, in areas, institutionalized racism. So she called on the Home Office to begin a whole program of education for its workers and for ministers in our colonial history. And that's in part what I've tried to do, to give some of the context to that in this book, because you can't understand why it was that this whole mess happened without knowing that in 1948 a kind of system of free movement was created between people in Commonwealth countries or Britain's colonies and Britain, the mother country. And people were allowed to move, people were invited to come here. And it was only gradually through a series of increasingly restrictive immigration legislation that their position kind of invisibly moved from being legal to being illegalized. And ministers themselves just weren't aware of this, which is why when all of the kind of hostile environment policies began to be introduced from 2010 onwards, there was kind of so little knowledge of the kind of catastrophic consequences that they could have. So again, it was really great in a book, unlike in kind of constraints of a newspaper article, to have the space to go for a really detailed kind of summary of some of those bits of legislation and some of that history.
It is shocking though, isn't it, to think that people working in government don't understand a history that I think is quite recent and take for granted. And, you know, we've had Windrush anniversaries for the last couple of decades, and that they haven't taken it on board. And also that clearly, I don't think it's part of the education system. And unless you're studying, I don't know, sociology, I don't know what you'd study at university in order to be taught about that history. And also that's something that's happening at the moment, you know, with the Black Lives Matter movement. And the fact that still today, people don't understand Britain's involvement in the slave trade. They will understand, because it's been taught, African-American, or rather Americans' version of the transatlantic slave trade, but not about our own version. So it's, yeah, I think it's just shocking that people are so ignorant, and that's why it's so important. History needs to be taught, I think.
Yeah, well, one of the most amazing parts of the reporting for this book for me was going to Jamaica, where I'd never been before, and meeting a lot of politicians and historians there who were still feeling quite kind of wounded by the relatively recent visit of David Cameron in 2015, who went over there and who was surprised to be asked by a lot of people there about whether or not Britain was considering paying reparations for slavery. And I think he just hadn't realised that that was still a topic for discussion. And also who were really affronted when he came bearing this kind of gift from the British government of the offer to build a new prison in Kingston, with the idea that then we would be able to send back a lot of prisoners of Jamaican origin from the UK back to Jamaica, and you know that kind of gift was refused. But again, it's a kind of another really stark example of how little that kind of bit of history and all of the sensitivities are understood by politicians.
Yeah. I mean, one of my characters in the novel, Winsome, is somebody who comes to Britain in the 1950s, and she is the only Windrush generation character in the book. And it's so interesting because when this blew up through your journalism, until that point, I didn't know what was happening. But if I had known what was happening, I would have created Winsome as a character who is forced to go back to her home country in Barbados,
right?
Because I love Winsome as a character. She's a wonderful woman. She comes over in the 50s. She's married to Clovis. They've been together for a long time. She's a mother of 3 children. She's a grandmother. She's put her roots down in this country, and she's perhaps one of the more familiar characters in the book to people because she is somebody from the Caribbean of that generation.
And yet such a surprising character.
Oh yes. Well, you've always got to have people with their secrets. They're dirty little secrets.
Yeah.
To then at the end, instead of having her leading this lovely life, returning to her home with her pension and everything, to have everything taken away from her and not understanding it. I think that would have been a brilliant thing to put into the book, because one of the things we can do as writers, and you do in your book to a certain extent as well, is that you introduce us to these people and you you help us to engage with them as ordinary people who are leading their ordinary lives, who suddenly have to face this trauma.
Tell me a bit about the 12 characters, because you were quite explicit in saying that you wanted to bring 12 very different characters into light, and to display these characters who haven't normally frequently been characters in British fiction.
Yeah, so it was quite organic. So I started off with Carol, who is a young woman who's from a Nigerian immigrant background, and then her mother came into her story, and then I gave her mother her own story, and then I gave her school friend her own story, and they form you know, 3 of the main characters in the book. And as you say, there are 12, and each sort of set of triplets, if you like, they all have some sort of direct connection, and then all the characters are in some way interconnected through X degrees of separation. And as you said, I wanted to just expand the representation of who we are in this country rather than define it, or reduce it, because you can't, because as I've said many times, we are all things and everything, just like every other group in this society. So I just wanted to say, look, we're more than what you may know about us. And to be honest, a lot of people don't know much about us. So they're aged 19 to 93. They are every generation in between. That was really, really important. Some of them are migrants who have come from another place. A lot of them are born in Britain, because I wanted to make the point about people who are born here and raised here, and this is the only country they know. Although, as you have written about in your book, that was the case for a lot of these people. They come as children, you know, came as very young child. And like for them, it was the only country they know. And then just to explore who they might be. And I was thinking about sexuality. I thought, okay, they're not all going to be straight. And so a percentage of the women are on the queer spectrum. Class came into the book without me even thinking about it, really, because I was looking at where people start with in their lives and where they end up. And for those people who become more successful in terms of their professions, then they do kind of go shift class. And also I was looking at what it's like to be a Black woman in a society where there are certain kinds of perceptions of who you are based on stereotypes, and people don't really know who you are. So when you go outside of what people expect you to be doing, so, you know, one character, Bumi, is a cleaner, but as I mentioned, but her daughter Carol actually goes to Oxford and becomes a banker. So
and she's a maths graduate herself.
Yes. Yeah, and then the mother is a maths graduate and has to get a cleaning job because she can't get any work in the UK, sort of befitting her degree.
Yeah.
And that's,
I mean, to me, that's a very familiar story, having spoken to so many people who are struggling with Britain's immigration system, that people with extraordinary talents who've come from Pakistan, for example, as lawyers or as biochemists from Syria, come here and are working in Uber roles or as night cleaners. I mean, really, I thought Bumi was an amazing character.
Yes, and it's been like that for a very long time, and just at the level of people applying for jobs and they have foreign names. You know, there was research done, it might have actually been The Guardian a few years ago, where they actually, you know, experimented to see how many people were offered job interviews based on their names, and they had people with the same CV but different names, and if they had an English name, then they were offered an interview. If they had a foreign name, they don't. So Bumi gives her daughter the name Carol because that's how she knows that's going to help her succeed in, you know, in the workforce. But when Carol is in the workforce, she then comes across, you know, sort of the institutional might where she is the exception and she's not treated equally. So she constantly has to fight to establish herself and to be treated with the kind of respect that would automatically be conferred on other people.
Do you think Carol would be out marching this week?
No, Carol wouldn't. She's kind of like left her working class origins behind, and she has a completely different facade and to some extent interior in order to succeed. Amma, who is the theatre director, she's a lesbian, she's radical activist, got a show opening at the National Theatre. She is somebody who would be out marching, and she would have been out marching.
Carol might be watching the news and thinking about it.
I don't think Carol would. You're being too kind to Carol. Carol's on a very narrow path to success. She won't even have a ringtone for her phone that would, that would kind of reveal anything about herself in terms of her being a Black person. So she listens to the Nigerian musician Fela Kuti, but her ringtone is, I think it's Vivaldi's Four Seasons or something. Amma would be marching, her daughter Yaz would be marching, and probably Megan Morgan, the non-binary figure, would be marching. I think that's probably it. I think you realised when you were writing your book and writing your articles that what you were coming across was that people were just being seen as numbers, that they had been dehumanized. And I think that ties in very directly to my project as a writer, because there are so few portrayals of people of color in this, especially Black people and Black women in our fictional world or anywhere, to be honest. So people don't really know what they're dealing with. So can you talk about, when you were writing the book, how you brought them to life, and also what kind of moral questions you were grappling with, and whether you showed people their chapters before you published, and whether there was any kind of comeback on it?
So the kind of need to have people's human experiences in the paper was really obvious to me right from the beginning, because a lot of the policy problems that lie behind everything having gone wrong are incredibly complicated, very head-spinning, quite boring if you're not kind of engaged with Home Office policy issues, and actually, to be frank, quite hard to get a news editor excited about unless you can really explain how a policy change has caused extreme difficulties for an individual or a group of individuals. And in that way, I think I was really fortunate that the first person who I interviewed about all of this had a really, really extreme experience. This was a woman called Paulette Wilson, who'd been here for 50 years, who'd come from Jamaica as a child, and who was twice arrested and sent to Yarlswood detention centre, and who was about to be deported back to Jamaica, which she hadn't visited for 50 years, when I first heard about her. Luckily, that was kind of staved off by her MP and by this charity. But her kind of experience in its own rights was just a kind of really staggering bit of cruelty by the Home Office, and it seemed at the time that it was just a mistake on their part. It was kind of really important to explain to readers that the details of her life, so that they could understand that this wasn't just a kind of minor error by the Home Office, but this was a really staggering mistake that they'd made. And again, that process of kind of trying to capture readers' attention by explaining that these policies were having really, really profound impacts on real humans who we are kind of, who are our neighbours, who we live amongst, was quite important, because otherwise articles on, reforms to immigration legislation just aren't really read by anyone. And that the process of interviewing people and telling their stories on the pages of a national newspaper are quite fraught, because to begin with, a lot of people are very, very nervous about coming forward and talking about their immigration status, not least because they were well aware of how brutal the Home Office can be, and also how unpredictable the Home Office can be. So it's not something that anybody would really kind of relish. It's to come forward and say, of course, I want my picture in the paper. I want a headline that suggests that I've been classified as an illegal immigrant. I mean, understandably, people were nervous. So part of my job is kind of about helping people to understand what the kind of what the risks of doing that kind of thing are, and helping people understand that they can be anonymous if they want to be. But largely, most of the people who I spoke to, by the time I spoke to them, were so furious about the treatment that they'd experienced that they actually didn't want to be anonymous, and they did want to speak about it. But mostly, I think kind of without exception, actually, everyone who's been in the book has found it quite a positive experience, and probably not least because of the really brazen way in which the Home Office went around doing damage limitation with every case. So when they heard that we were going to write about these cases, they really sprung into action and tried to sort out people's immigration problems. So not focusing on the systemic issues, but trying to sweep away every little problem. And that was a positive outcome for most of the people who were interviewed.
It's interesting because as a writer, I know what my intention is, but there's a lot of freedom in terms of how I express it. But I don't really know how my work is going to be received or the impact of it. I can't force anybody to engage with my characters, to like my characters, even if that's important. It's very different. So I do a lot of talks for different groups, and I gave a talk for a marketing company not that long ago. And they said, well, what's your goal? What do you want people to think and feel from your books? And I said, well, I don't know. You just put it out there, and then it lands where it lands. And if it lands well, then you're very lucky. But I think it's very different. For you, it's about, there is a goal, especially with this, wasn't there? There was a goal to raise awareness.
There was a goal. Yeah, there was a goal to make the Home Office and make ministers realise that there was a huge problem. And actually, for a very long time, they refused to realise that, and it was kind of incredibly frustrating. And in a way, they only decided to realise it because they were pushed into a very embarrassing situation when the kind of all of the Commonwealth government leaders were in London, and they were kind of embarrassed that they'd been shown to have not dealt with this issue.
I suppose final question, we've nearly come to the end. Why did you want to become a reporter, and how do you feel now that you've done this, even though it's still ongoing?
I just always did. I mean, at school I wanted to. I spent a lot of time working abroad. I studied Russian, and I worked in Russia for a long time, and in France and in India. And,
you're slipping.
Oh, thank you. It's the blue tack. Thank you. I'm going to hold it to do this kind of reporting. And I guess I just want to go on writing about it. I mean, my job at The Guardian is to write about policy and look at the kind of human fallout from policy that is dreamt up in Westminster. And so there's no shortage of that. And I think there will be no shortage of that.
Yes.
What about you? How do you feel having won the Booker, being number one in on the bestseller lists? I mean, does it mean that you feel like you can relax now and kind of give up, or is it motivating to do something new?
Surreal. It's everything since October last year has been really surreal, and I don't feel I can relax at all. I mean, I love the fact that my work is out there and being read by so many people. That gives me such joy, because I have been publishing since '94. My first book was in '94, and I'm not even going to tell you what my sales figures were, because I really wasn't reaching many people at all. And now I am. And I'm reaching them with a radical experimental book about 12 primarily Black British women. And I love that. I love that people in Middle England are reading the book. And they wouldn't normally be reading it, I don't think. And the fact that I've got to number one, hopefully, and the fact that I won the Booker, hopefully that will be part of a new movement to try to get the publishing industry to be more inclusive in terms of who they publish. because it's showing that it can be done with a book like mine. And I'm thinking about the next book at the moment, and I'm never short of ideas. I have hundreds of ideas, and every idea is a genius idea until like half an hour later, and I'm like, oh no, it's not going to work. So, and then next year I'll start writing a new book, and it will be what it will be. I don't know, but along the lines of the kinds of areas that I explore still, and I'm excited by it. So yeah.
Great. Well, I'm excited to read it.